Hi, and welcome to It's Not History. I'm Charles Stewart, and today we're going to conclude our series Conestoga Town with the second part of our two-part episode, Still Here. And we're going to continue our discussion with Michael Mantooth, historian, activist, and member of the Conestoga Susquehannock tribe.
Yeah, so, to start, I think we have to talk a little bit about, you know, Conestoga Town as a community, not as, a list of 20 names that were on the census and those are all the people who have ever been in the tribe. I think there's a little bit of misunderstanding sometimes about how the community functioned. And I think that makes it easy for people to say that it was extinct by saying, well, there's 22 people on the census, they killed 22 people, that's the end of it. And I think that misses a lot. So we know that in that first prior to the massacre, we know there's a lot of kinship relationships to all these different tribes. We know some stayed among the Lenape. We know some went up north. We know some stayed down south. There's a big diaspora. So that's the first thing. And that diaspora is not necessarily independent of each other. There's movement, there's progress. We hear the survivors will say different things like, oh, we were in New York at the time. The first initial survivors of the very first massacre were actually out of the town at the time that it happened. So, there's already an understanding or knowledge, that this one geographical place does not consist of every member of the tribe. And this is further explored when post-massacre, there's a 1775 agreement from the Penn family, which basically seeks to get rid of any land claims to the area. And the 1775 land claimants are listed in that document as being Cayuga people, which, I think for me was initially a little confusing, even though, Cayuga people are Haudenosaunee. They're part of that alliance, so, it makes sense that there might be some connection, but why are they all Cayuga particularly? And that's actually through Chief Shikellamy. So Shikellamy married a Cayuga woman, and in our tradition, as well as the Haudenosaunee tradition, your children are part of the tribe that your wife is from. And so his children are all Cayuga people. And in a 1757 deposition, Shikelamy's sister is explicitly recorded as a Conestoga Indian, and there has been some suggestion from historians that Shikellamy himself might have been Conestoga. Shikellamy survived past the massacre, as did many other people, and their relationships among the Cayuga are why that document trying to clear land claims were signed with Cayuga people, because his children were considered Cayuga. And that moves forward and becomes very, very important a little later because, in 1776, obviously, we have the outbreak of the American Revolution. And what a lot of people don't know about the American Revolution is that the Haudenosaunee were heavily involved and, in fact, nearly completely split apart because of the American Revolution, because the Oneida, who were led by John Shenandoah at the time to side with the American revolutionaries, were facing off against other members of the Haudenosaunee, because every other tribe within the Haudenosaunee, including the Cayuga, who also included descendants, sided with the British. And that created massive discontinuity and a really traumatic issue for the Haudenosaunee people, because we have two lines that we know survived beyond any shadow of the doubt. We have the Cayuga line and we have the Oneida line. The Oneida coming from John Shenandoah, who was adopted at Conestoga Town prior to the massacre into the Oneida tribe, which is something the Oneida Indian Nation also acknowledges, because even though he was an incredible chief, he couldn't be a hereditary chief because he was not born into the Oneida Nation. So fast forward a little bit, we have this major issue with the American Revolution. It disrupts the entire region. The United States then, as we know it, is only about 40 years old at the point in 1845 when Peter Dockstader, who is living among the Oneida in New York, files those initial land claims. So according to Peter Dockstader, he was a descendant of one of the residents of Conestoga Town who was not there at the time of the massacre. And him, along with 6 others, are all legal descendants of those treaty agreements through either their relationship among the Oneida or their relationships among the Cayuga. Now, what's really interesting is when he files those land claims, this is 1845. We don't have internet, we don't have phones, we don't have the level of information sharing that we have today. And at that point, he knew the boundaries of that land tract that had been set aside for his ancestors. He knew the agreement, he knew the rights that his people had. And not only did he know that, and did the other members of this group who were applying for their land rights, not only did they know that, they also collectively identified themselves as Conestoga people and sought their independence. Because our oral history tells us that when they went among the Haudenosaunee, the long-term plan was to establish them within as one of those independent nations. And the Revolutionary War and the way that it split apart the Haudenosaunee, combined with the fact that there was already so few Conestoga people remaining, caused them to merge with and remain among those tribes. But the desire for that independence as a community was strong enough that even with all of the turbulence of the American Revolution and all of the turbulence of this massacre and all of the turbulence of now the civil war within the Haudenosaunee, they still knew who they were. They still knew who their ancestors were. They knew what their rights were. They knew that they had treaty land in that area. And I think that's something that can't be understated, how important that is in showing that this is a community, that they had this information. And so they filed the land claims in 1845 seeking the return of these acres in Lancaster County. And, they're not particularly successful in doing that. The process is deeply complicated, and you can see in newspaper articles at the time, people in the area, non-native people in the area, were also very concerned because it now occurs to them they might not actually have legal title to the land that they've been farming for, 50, 80 years. And you see that there's this deep concern. And then all of a sudden people start publishing in the newspaper these agreements that were made post-massacre, the 1775 agreement with the Cayuga. And it says, oh, no, don't worry, guys. We don't have to give them anything because we have these two clarifications here that state specifically that any dependent tribe of the Haudenosaunee is not entitled to this land. And the Conestoga would certainly fall into that category as a result of the earlier covenant chain that was made when they first moved into the area at Lancaster. So from there, Peter Dockstader ends up going back up to the New York Oneida people that he was staying among and starts lobbying there to try to get the land back because it's taking really long. He's getting quite old, and there hasn't been any real progress on the issue aside from the state basically saying we have these two agreements. No one is entitled to this land. You have free title if you already own it. And in 1872, he's actually enormously successful in that Robert Holland Duell, who was a representative from the state of New York, introduced a joint resolution into the U.S. House of Representatives that would have returned the entire tract for our use in perpetuity. And in that joint resolution, he specifies specifically the area that would be returned, and that it would be returned in perpetuity, and that it was being returned because there was a remnant of the tribe remaining with the Oneidas in the state of New York. So that's the first major movement that we see in legal documentation about why and how and who is coming back and saying this land is actually ours. So from there, it becomes quite difficult. The bill ends up being tabled, nothing actually happens there, and Peter Dockstader dies 2 years later. And we see that there's still research happening about this right now because we know that he did get some land in Lancaster, Peter Dockstader, because he actually left that land in a deed to her name is Miss Ida Hall. She was a teacher on the Oneida Indian Reservation who had lobbied for the return of the Conestoga land and was a huge proponent of Conestoga culture and identity. And he left 200 acres in Lancaster County to her. So clearly he did manage to get land through some other means, which we're not entirely sure how that happened yet, and we're actually looking into the land records on it now. But following that, you have this period of, there's not a lot happening. Peter Dockstader has passed away. We know that there are still natives in the area. We know that there are actually Conestoga Indians who came back from New York into Lancaster and York after the start of this legal proceeding to return the land because they were so optimistic. You can see them on the census. Miss Catherine Benson is listed as American Indian on the 1880 census in York County. Her and her descendants have been involved in the tribe to this day. She came down expecting the return of that land. She met a man and married and had her children there. Her descendants were also at the Holy Providence School for Colored and Indian People. So it's clear that identity was maintained over time. And you see several other families. You see the Jackson family marked as American Indian on the census. You see Amanda Shaw's marked as an Indian servant on the census. Because before 1860, you couldn't be recorded as American Indian on the census. It wasn't a race that was classified. You were just colored or something else. So you start to see that, like, wait a minute, there are natives in this area in 1860, and some of those descendants were part of the Susquehannock Indian Reservation Bill efforts in the 1940s. Because if you fast forward to the 1940s, there's the emergence of this man called Chief Fireway. And Chief Fireway was an interesting case because he claimed to be the last chief of the Susquehannocks, and he actually descends distantly from the trader Jacob Young, who most people are familiar with, who kind of know anything about Susquehannock history. And actually the tribe today would not consider Chief Fireway or his descendants eligible for enrollment because there actually isn't sufficient evidence that Jacob Young ever had a Susquehannock wife. But anyways, Fireway worked with local legislatures and had he had an ability to connect with and reach out to and be taken seriously by the local politicians in the area. And he actually succeeded in passing a bill that would have set up a reservation described as the Susquehannock Indian Reservation in Dauphin County, Pennsylvania. And it wasn't the return of land, which would have been better, but it was, a lease that had like a very affordable rate. It would have allowed us to have a cultural center, an area where our people could gather and stay together and sort of rebuild this community in a very literal sense. And, as you mentioned earlier, it passed unopposed. It was ready to go, and the governor of Pennsylvania vetoed it at the time. And among those efforts were the efforts of Miss Winona Jameson, who was recorded in the census as native in 1920, who then moved to live among the Nanticoke people in Delaware. And she, too, was identified explicitly as a Conestoga Indian in several different documents. And she not only advocated for the 1941 reservation, she also advocated for Nanticoke rights. She also continued to do so until her death in 1978. And there are people in the tribe today who have living memory of her and living memory of these efforts. And I think that's something that gets really, really lost in the discussion of the Conestoga Massacre, is that there is a long and continuous history of people not just identifying as Susquehannock or having ancestors who were Susquehannock, but who are politically active in trying to establish rights and protections for those people. And I think that's something that really has to be shared more. I think there's several reasons. First and foremost, to be fair, Governor Arthur James vetoed basically every cultural or historical measure that crossed his desk. That included far more than just the Susquehannock Indian Reservation. I can't remember. There's some museum things that had passed to get more funding for a museum that he'd vetoed. I mean, anything related to that kind of thing, he was just not having it. So there's that piece of it. He was clearly ideologically a small government kind of guy, and for him to fund any of these kinds of things was frivolous and unnecessary. I think the other piece of it is, this fear a little bit of what that might look like, and this kind of counterculture concern where, we're going into a global conflict. We have deep ideological concerns both, in Germany and in Eastern Europe, and we have all of these concerns, and then somebody starts talking about establishing a communal living space for a racial minority. I think in that context too, there's also this sense of, I don't know about that. I don't know if that's such a good idea right now. And then you have to compound that with the fact of, okay, if we lease the Susquehannock Indians a reservation in Dauphin County, if we were to allow something like that to go through, how long would it take for them to then want to claim the much more valuable land in Lancaster and return to the area that there's already substantial documentation for being theirs, right? And I think that plays into it. I think, the historical misinformation plays into it a lot. He was advised by the state historical officer that there were no Conestoga Indians remaining, which was something else that, I have always been mystified as to why this narrative is so dominant when, I have an education, but I don't have access to any historical records that everybody else doesn't also have access to. When I go over these details about the 1845 land claims and the 1941 Indian Reservation Bill, none of those things are secrets. They're not locked up somewhere where no one else can find them. But at the same time, thinking about that social environment, thinking about the global environment and the conflict we're about to enter, thinking about the ideological principles of the governor who believes that the government should be, out of these kinds of projects, it's no surprise that even a bill just to allow us to rent land would not be passed at that point in time. And that's, I think, a function of how difficult it is to be such a small minority in such a large world, where all of these other factors are preventing you from getting what you're entitled to, and you don't have the leverage to really force it to go your way. People do very odd things when there's a motivation, right? When there's a monetary motivation, when there's concerns about the loss of land rights, to land that he might have owned some of that land. I don't know. But, I also think there's something very interesting about American Indian affairs that, for whatever reason, inspires a certain amount of dishonesty in people. And I'm not entirely sure where it comes from, but even looking, historically, looking at modern times, there's always this tendency around Native American issues to, stretch the truth or misrepresent the truth or do these different things, and sometimes in very bizarre ways. We see this a little bit, for example, in the case of Chief Fireway, right, who was mentioned earlier as kind of the proponent of the big public face of the 1941 Susquehannock Indian Reservation Bill. Now, whether through his own sayings or through the way the newspapers represented him, right, there's a lot of inconsistencies there. There's claims that he went to Carlisle Indian School, and people make that claim frequently, and I don't think they realize both how offensive that is and also how incredibly easy that is to verify as false. Indian schools in general kept very, very good records in terms of which students were there. And the reason for that was because they received payments from the federal government for the student body. So, if you had been a student at Carlisle Indian School, there would be records to confirm that. And you see this in cases. There's a case in Canada that's ongoing right now in which a letter forgery occurs, that included a single letter was forged to state that someone was Algonquin when they were not, and as a result of that one letter, 1,200 people were then enrolled into the tribe and given per capita benefits for a land sale that they were not entitled to. That happened very, very recently. I'm happy to send you an article about it. It's very, very, very interesting. And for whatever reason, there's something about this topic and the I think glamour of it in some ways, perhaps, or the genuine difficulty in accessing records about some of these things. When you think about like old genealogical records, when we talk about, anything pre-1860 gets a little dicey. And if we're talking about Native American genealogy pre-1860, it's incredibly difficult. So, I don't know what it is about this specific topic that causes people to behave somewhat irrationally or say things or do things that are just objectively false. And you see this with a lot of anthropologists at this time period, making all kinds of bizarre statements and having these increasingly more headline-esque research findings that they can put out there. And you see that to this day. How many times do we find that there's fake data in a major research breakthrough that someone published, even at major institutions? And I think maybe it's because in Native American issues are viewed as a topic of research, as a topic of, intellectual interest, and not necessarily as a living history with people who can actually fact check some of these things, like what you're talking about with these forged letters saying that there were these terrible things that were happening, or that the Conestogas were actually, there was an interesting news article that I saw where they basically said, don't feel bad for them, they had it coming. Like, okay. Oh yeah, there it is. It's science says Susquehannock deserved inglorious demise. Like you see these kinds of hot takes, or these desperate attempts to justify the atrocity that occurred. And you see that in many contexts. There's claims that are made in some sort of historical depositions or contexts where they try to say that the Conestogas were cannibals, or these types of things that it's like, I don't think that actually tracks, but it does make the context of our extermination feel more justified. And maybe that's where that comes from, is this kind of deep need to verify that our society is on the right track, and we didn't actually mess up that badly because they were actually doing X, Y, or Z. And there's an attempt to obscure the objectivity of how wrong it is to have done what they had done. And I think that's something that causes people maybe to be willing to be very dishonest. Yeah, that's great. So,
Okay.
the tribe today is in a pretty precarious situation that I think isn't very well understood by people outside of the general federal Indian law space. We're an unrecognized tribe. We are currently seeking recognition in the state of Maryland, actually, because the state of Maryland has a process for recognition and the state of Pennsylvania does not. We have reached out to local politicians in the state of Pennsylvania and not gotten any response. So, we're trying to do whatever we can do to secure our legal status, because in doing that, we will finally, after, all of these years, we will finally have established once and for all that it is factually true that not just individual people survived from this, catastrophic event in our history, but our tribe, in fact, survived this catastrophic event in our history. And from there, our biggest goals are really about supporting our community and supporting the history and the things that do remain. Our biggest ambition is to provide space for documented Susquehannock and Conestoga people to share their experiences, to live in their culture, to share their history, to be recognized for who they are, and to have their contributions be recognized as valid and legitimate. Because in American Indian issues, right, you'll find that every tribe is basically considered fraudulent up until the moment they get recognition. At which point people are finally willing to have a conversation or sit at the table with you. And it's unfortunate that it is that way, and it's unfortunate that it has to be that way, because there are a lot of fraudulent, unrecognized tribes, and it does become a major issue. But that's kind of our first goal. And beyond that, we're working on a language preservation project. The Mingo language was actually the first dictionary of Mingo language comes from Conestoga Town, from Bill Sack, who was killed in the massacre. And, we found that there's actually a very large repository of that language that remains today. We're working with actually a local university to try to build an app to make that more accessible for anybody who wants to just come along and learn it and figure out how they can communicate with us in our language and have that piece of history with them. We're working right now on establishing a nonprofit division, not just for our tribe, but for Native issues in the area in general, for the sole purpose of re-indigenizing the Conestoga area. That has been, I think, very sorely missed and not been particularly well nourished beyond the kind of periodic festivals or sort of short-term interactions. We are so motivated and we're so passionate about this, in part because we know that there's a expiration date on our efforts. If we can't establish ourselves by a certain point in time, then we might have lost that fight to share that message and to preserve that part of our culture, our history, and our identity. Yes, in that we have to open that window, and we have to do it now. Unfortunately, the state of Pennsylvania does not have a recognition process. There is no window there. We have to go to the state of Maryland. We're looking into whether or not a bill that has been tabled since like 1872 can be reintroduced to at least have something in motion to move beyond our current status, so that we can really start to have those conversations and have a seat at the table with institutions and local stakeholders, and be able to say, like, we're not just a group of hobbyists or what have you. We are a tribe of recognized people, and we can back that up, and here's our history, and here's this, and here's that. And that's something that I think there's a limited window of opportunity for, in terms of just, I think about the things that our tribal members can share, and the concerns we have, as does any tribe at this point in time, about, what happens if our elders pass before they're able to pass on everything that they had wanted to. What happens when the stories around the 1941 Indian Reservation Bill are lost to time because the only people who knew them have passed? And to have the resources to be able to collect that information, to have the resources to be able to support our community and support opportunities for our youth to engage with our elders and to learn that information and retain that information. That's where I think we see the biggest concern in the next 10 years is, if we don't acquire the resources to be able to do that, then not only will we not have recognition, we won't have those things that make us entitled to recognition anymore. And that's something that is deeply concerning at all levels. So, in the state of Pennsylvania, for example, the state of Maryland, it's an application process. And this is true for most states that have a recognition process. You supply certain historical documents, you supply this, that, and the other, you go to a committee, the committee votes. And in full disclosure, there's a lot of controversy about this process because it varies widely from state to state, and in some states there's been sharp criticism that the requirements are too lax and the tribes they are recognizing are fraudulent. In fact, this, I will say, not on behalf of the tribe, but on my personal opinion that that is absolutely the case, right? And I think that's part of where the fear in the state of Pennsylvania in establishing that process comes from. There's a fear because there are organizations in the state of Pennsylvania today who will certainly seek recognition if there's a process, despite the fact that they are not legally entitled to it. And I think that creates a huge issue between the federally recognized tribes of those, like, for example, the federally recognized Lenape will always oppose the recognition of the Lenape Nation of Pennsylvania, right? And in our case, it's unfortunate that we're caught in the middle of this because there is no federally recognized tribe to arbitrate claims of Susquehannock kinship. There is no federally recognized tribe that represents our language, our culture, our historical sites, our history, our massacres. There is no federally recognized tribe that does that. And we don't step on anybody's toes. And yet we live in a state where there are numerous groups who do infringe on the sovereignty of these federally recognized tribes. And I think that creates an environment in the state of Pennsylvania where there's great fear about establishing a process like that and then having to contend with the opposition of some pretty powerful federally recognized tribes who would take issue with that. And I find that we're kind of caught in the middle here because we don't have the resources of a federally recognized tribe, but we do have the historical backing that these other tribes don't have. And that creates a very difficult situation for us and a very difficult situation for the state of Pennsylvania, because the truth is, to establish a process, you would need to really have expert opinions involved. You would need to have an understanding of federal Indian law. You would need to have an understanding of the process of how tribes transition from state recognition to federal recognition and the implications, because once a tribe is given recognition, even in cases where it's undeniably fraudulent, right? Once they are given recognition of any kind, anything you do to retract that recognition will always be seen in a negative light. They will always be seen as martyrs. So you have to make sure that when you recognize, you've done it right the first time, because there's no room for error there. And I think it's so complicated that in the state of Pennsylvania, our goal was to lobby through political representatives to introduce a bill and go a legislative route, because establishing an actual process, I think, would just be so dicey and so fraught with major pitfalls that it would be very difficult to get that done. Exactly. And I'll say there are members of our tribe today who would rather us remain unrecognized in perpetuity than to have to share the same status with tribes that, to be frank, are just they are objectively incorrect. The claims they make are false. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it, and there's no nice way to say it. It's you have no historical documentation whatsoever to back up the claims you are making, and you want to put us on that same status, and that damages our efforts in the long run. Yeah, we've started to be more vocal and to be more visible. We talked to a local school district about their mascot. We've gotten involved in some museum outreach and different things just to try to, I think right now it's difficult because we reached out to a politician in Lancaster and just didn't get a response. We reached out to the governor of Pennsylvania. We didn't get a response. We reached out to some Harrisburg politicians. We didn't get a response. So it's been, I think the challenge is it's so difficult to be taken seriously, and that's part of why we shifted and instead started sending our tribal chairwoman Andrea Ligon. She lives in the area, and she has been very, very vocal and has started being very, very visible and going out to these different places and establishing ourselves within the community as visible, right, as part of this. And I think that's a good place to start, to try to open the door for some of those politicians where it's I don't feel at the moment that they're particularly receptive, but perhaps if they were to see us I don't know, giving a speech at the library, or interacting at the museum, or sharing some kind of piece of our culture or our language in another context, maybe that might open their minds a little bit more to be more responsive when we reach out with these kinds of concerns. This was the Southern York County School District who they voted to remove the mascot, and we wrote this really lovely letter commending their decision. And then they voted to reinstate it, and then we had to go back and edit the letter. Like 2 weeks later, I think they voted to reinstate it because they had school board elections, and a lot of school board members ran specifically on bringing back the mascot. And it's like, man, why are we still doing this? Like, come on. Yeah, I think it's good to have that perspective. I mean, I think like I said, I try to be very optimistic about things. And I always assume that whenever people have this response where they're very sorry about what happened and they would like to put a plaque up, I have to assume that that comes from a place of ignorance of the history beyond the massacre, right? Which, to be fair, is something that has not been publicly, it's not like you go into a public school in Lancaster and they're talking about the 1941 Susquehannock Indian Reservation Bill. To be fair to the community at large, this information has been buried, has been not acknowledged, has been set aside for fear of losing valuable land, for fear of having a distinct cultural community come back or return or be involved in a way that may not be welcome or may not be peaceful or may be uncomfortable. And I think I would be very curious to hear. And this is something I wish we had more of, was I would be very curious to hear the thoughts from people working in these areas in Lancaster, after reading our history section, after having that education, after seeing that, like, oh, this is not, just like, four people who have a great, 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 great grandmother who was a Cherokee princess. I'd be very curious to see how their opinion changes and is informed by having access to that information. And also, how will that play out in terms of actionable things? Because I think one thing that's difficult for us as a tribe with having so few resources, even just in terms of human capital, of people who can go out and have these conversations, is we have to prioritize as a tribe the things that we think are going to have the most likelihood of having an actionable benefit to our community. And I think that can be a little difficult at times because we have, sometimes we'll get requests to do different things where the expectation, is that we will be providing a lot of resources and time to things, and to put that amount of time and resources from our community into a particular issue or event when we have this aging population, we have a sense of urgency, and then for the benefit for having done that to be a plaque is not ideal. Like that's not the ideal exchange rate there when we have such limited time and such a great concern to get this done. And then they're like, oh well, we are very happy that you've come, so we would like to say sorry and we'll put this plaque on the wall. And it's like, okay, but like we're here for something else. We're here for an acknowledgement, not of a historical wrong, which has been acknowledged repeatedly over the course of the last 200 years. We are looking for acknowledgement as a living people who are facing a living injustice, who are continuously not having access to our religious freedoms because as an unrecognized tribe, we can't request eagle feathers from the federal repository. We want to do something about these living injustices that we continue to deal with. And I think that can be a little bit more challenging for people to contend with. And as it's like, oh, I need more than a sorry, actually. Like, I need you to tell me what we can do to make sure that our people have access to the same resources as any other American Indian tribe might. Yeah. So I think the number one thing that you can do to support the tribe today um, is to reach out to institutions, to whether that's a city, that's a library, it's an academic institution. Whenever you see a source that states that we are extinct, reach out to them and inform them that we are not. That is the number one thing you can do. And I say that because, we are a tribe of there are fewer than 50 tribal members remaining. and most of our people are in their later years. So, the ability to reach out and send emails and follow up on those kinds of issues is very limited. We only have so many people, and there's a bajillion websites that say those kinds of things. So that's something that's very simple. It's free. It just costs you some time. That's something that is so critical and so important, is to get the message out there that not only are we still here, we have historical documentation to prove it. And the second thing that I think people can do is to really reconsider their relationship with American Indian people as a whole, and to educate themselves on the differences between natives on different spectrums. So I say that because I think a lot of times people really want to support native communities and native people, and so they want to create opportunities for native speakers, they want to create opportunities for native artists, and they do that without first educating themselves on what it means to be Native American. And as a result of that, they often find themselves giving those opportunities to people who are not actually Native, or it turns out after the fact that that they are not who they said they were. And I think that's something that is very, very important, that people should educate themselves on what is the difference between a state recognized tribe and a federally recognized tribe, and why is that important when I'm offering an opportunity for a Native American artist. Why is it important that I make sure that the people I give these opportunities to are Native American people, and are not, vaguely Native and don't have vague ancestry claims, but that they have a specific tribe that they actually can speak for and represent the communities that they come from? That, I would say, is probably the second most important thing, especially in an area like Lancaster, where, we are not surrounded by federally recognized tribes. We're not surrounded by a whole lot of resources and education about who is or is not Native American. And I think the most well-meaning intentions can often go awry when people don't kind of educate themselves on those basic, fundamental aspects of Native American identity. And the third thing I would say that people can do, and this is something that we're actively working on right now, you can donate. We are starting a nonprofit this coming month because we've had people who literally are asking to leave us property, to give us donations of land itself, and we need an organization to manage that. Money talks at the end of the day. And if I think about my own experiences, when I'm short on time but high on empathy, I donate some money. It always helps. And we have not accepted donations to date because we didn't have an organizational structure that would support that and that would allow us to be transparent with our donors about, where is that money actually going, and making sure that they feel confident that the donations that they're making are being put to good use. So that's the third thing. And it's not everything, but donations also help.
This is Lee Francis, author of Ghost River and a member of the Pueblo tribe.
I think in connecting with the Conestoga Susquehannock folks, the hardest part, I think, is that just the migrations of people. And what we know is that, that these waves of warfare forced most of their population into other locations, into, within other tribal structures and with other kinship. And so the hardest part that I think that we have to recognize and reconcile within Indigenous America, but also again with humanity, is the territory and diaspora and what that means, right? So if I leave this place, am I still of that place? If I've gone in and married, is this still my ancestors and my kin? Or, how far do I trace that back? How much do we say that we're connected over here or over there? And I think that's where, that's one of the things I think that in a non-colonial space, it's very hard, is the need to engage in those kinds of conversations. But in more colonial spaces, a lot of that is saying this thing happened, we actually have a record of it, and I can trace my ancestry back to it. So we'd really like to be able to recognize that for our own peoples, and to be able to bring their memories forward. So I think any moment of recognition with Conestoga, Susquehannock, with, Lumbee, with, all of our Virginia tribes, Southern Virginia tribes that just got federal recognition, is what does that concept of recognition mean? How are we, continuing to bring forward those traditions and those ancestral spaces? And what does it mean to be, I think, the recognition part, always important, but then what does that mean going forward to be Conestoga, to be Susquehannock? Like what are we, how do you then behave? And I think that's our work as historians in many ways. And that's the work as Indigenous historians, is to try and bring as much of that stuff to be able to connect us back to our ancestors, because that was shattered due to warfare, genocide, ethnocide, America, etc.
So I started this long journey of a podcast series trying to answer what I thought was a simple, straightforward question. What happened to the people the rivers are named after? And at this point, after 22 episodes, maybe a simple question deserves a simple answer. A lot happened, but they're still here. I'd like to thank you for joining me while I tried to understand this, and hope you found it worth it. And I'd also like to thank my many contributors whose voices you've heard and who have made this series possible. Kevin Kenny, Scott Paul Gordon, Matthew Kruer, Will Fenton, Molly Wolanski, Chuck Hahn, Debbie Saylor, Lee Francis, Daniel Richter, Michael Mantooth, and a special thanks to Jack Brubaker for his amazing book, The Massacre of the Conestoga, and for keeping me on track and honest while I navigated my way through this series. And I'd especially like to thank those of you, my listeners, my extended kin, who have reached out to me with a lot of great ideas on topics you'd like me to explore in more depth. And I can promise you that in the coming year, I'm going to be following up on this series, both to update you on the efforts of the Conestoga Susquehannock to get the recognition that they so clearly deserve, and topics that are related to this, that even after 22 episodes, I didn't really have the time to dive into. For example, the Carlisle Indian School or the Shanks Ferry people. By the way, one of the It's Not History community, an archaeologist in Pennsylvania, sent me a picture of the remains of the Shanks Ferry person, who I remembered all those years ago from a display in the North Museum in Lancaster. So I wasn't imagining it. Thanks very much for sending that along. And he also sent along some amazing maps and archaeological surveys. So thanks. And if you have any ideas for any episodes or would just like to reach out, I'm at itsnothistory.com, or you can message me directly on Instagram at itsnothistory. Thanks for listening.